I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. This week I'm delighted to speak to Robert Galster, one of the co-founders of Safe Soil UK, about soil testing. I started working on a new project last year and it transpired that the previous owner of the site may have been spreading coal ash over the land and that it was hoped we could grow some edibles on the site. Common sense dictates that coal ash is probably not something you want in your soil, and so I endeavoured to get the soil tested. This is not an easy process. There are many companies offering soil testing, but the whole process is incredibly opaque. Companies offering the testing often don't tell you what to test for or offer to explain the results they'll be sending, and the process can be very costly. Enter SoilSafe UK, who offer soil tests for gardeners that make sense and don't cost a small fortune. Since reading around the subject, I'm really convinced we should be testing our soils a lot more often, so I think it's an important interview about a serious topic. I started by asking Robert what a soil test usually involves.
Well, it's a simple question, and I suppose there's a variety of things that it can involve. At its most basic, I suppose a soil test is nothing more complicated than picking up a cheap pH meter somewhere, sticking it in your soil, and seeing what the pH reading is. At the other end of the spectrum, when we want to look for more detailed, when we want to have a more detailed look into what's in our soil, we almost certainly have to involve the lab to do some testing for us. Now, this can be complicated, but it doesn't have to be. It depends very much. The containers we use and the sorts of things you need to be aware of are fairly straightforward. When it comes to chemical testing, we need to use amber glass, for example. We can use plastic for basic pH. All of these things, once you take all these things into consideration, you package up your sample, you send it up to a lab, and it will spit out the results. The problem is that whatever those results may be, the sort of task only begins then, because there is a matter of interpretation that comes into it. So, at its most basic, if we're looking at the fertility of soil, we test for basic elements that our plants need to thrive. We look at the pH. Of course, it can affect how easily those plants can use those, and then we look at organic matter and those other nutrients that are there. On the other side of things, when it comes to chemical testing, this is much more complicated. The variety of things we can look for is the number of things we can look for rather is as long as my arm. We tend to focus on sort of nasty things like heavy metals, lead, cadmium, chromium, a variety of hydrocarbons, and even asbestos, which in urban areas can be found in some soil samples, usually as a result of demolition projects that have taken place in the vicinity, where some of the asbestos was spread around and left hanging around in the air and then in the soil. So, just to wrap up the question, I guess it can be as easy or as complicated as you want it to be, depending on what your circumstance may be.
And would you need to provide the same sample for each of these tests?
It very much depends on what you're testing for. So when we send out sample kits, we often have a plastic bag because a simple clear plastic bag is absolutely fine if you're testing fertility. But when it comes for chemical testing, you need an amber jar. You need to limit the amount of air in the jar so that the sample isn't spoiled, and that when the lab gets the sample, it can run a test without the sample having been compromised. So it very much depends on what you're testing for.
Is there a difference between doing tests at a kind of a domestic scale or testing on a larger scale, or are the principles the same?
The principles are the same. The only thing one needs to keep in mind is that we suggest that people take a representative sample, which is taking little bits of soil from various parts of their growing space and from various depths, mixing it all into one, and producing this representative sample. This will give you this works fairly well for fairly small growing places. If you have a much larger plot, you may want to subdivide so that you don't get a misleading reading. So if you mix up soil from a variety of areas over a huge space, you can diminish the results and sort of miss the point of it all. So you may have to subdivide into smaller spaces. But the point is that an average home garden is going to be fine to take. It'd be fine to take a representative sample from that. If on the chemical side some nasty contamination comes up in the results, it may be worthwhile trying to drill down and find out exactly where it is. But in the first instance, just the one overall sample should be fine. We're looking really to set our minds at ease that everything is fine. So the expectation is that hopefully the results come back negative. If they come back positive, then of course we have to keep going, and we'll drill down and perhaps do some follow-up testing, and talk about some potential remediation strategies.
It was interesting what you said about the asbestos, because I think most people think if there was contaminants in the soil, they might come from things that were incorporated into the soil or kind of naturally occurred there, or I think maybe the thought of airborne things contaminated in the soil is quite a novel one maybe to some people. But in what circumstances might you commission a soil test? Why might you need one or think you needed one?
Well, people choose to test their soil for any number of reasons. As I said before, the most basic thing is a fertility test to check things like your pH level, whether your soil is acidic or alkaline, organic matter content, texture, as well as levels of major soil nutrients that are available for your plants to grow. The other very common reason people decide to test their soil is to check for contamination. The list of potentially harmful elements that can be lurking in its soil is, as I said before, as long as my arm, and that's no exaggeration. I actually have rather long arms, and still much longer than my arm. The basic ones, as I said, we look for heavy metals, lead, cadmium, mercury, various hydrocarbons, and asbestos. The most common sources of these are a history of industry, really. This is, of course, rather more common in our urban centers. And the key thing here to remember is that proximity to heavy traffic areas where airborne pollutants are present from anything from a car exhaust to industry factory stack. These exhausts can settle on the soil and remain there almost indefinitely. Countryside areas are also not necessarily exempt. Think about the historic mining operations scattered around the UK. They may also be responsible for having left behind a toxic legacy, as there's an awful lot of copper, nickel, etc. that is left over from the tailings from the mining operations, even if they've long been closed. Beyond that, there are a couple other things to remember. It's also possible that pathogens, E. coli, Salmonella, are sometimes present in sewage, and when areas are flooded, if our mains overflow and the sewage water the flood water contains some sewage, then some of these pathogens can end up in our soil. Then of course we have to be very, very careful. Make sure that we wash our produce in our hands very, very carefully after spending time in the garden. So there is one more reason that one may want to test, of course, is if you are near a farming area or an area that has a legacy of farming, then it is possible that pesticides and herbicides that were once used in the operation of the farm can linger. Often things that we used to use as pesticides and herbicides actually as recently as 10, 20 years ago, have since been deemed unsafe. And the legacy can remain in the soil for very, very long periods of time. Any of those or all of those or a combination of those is what prompts many people to have a look.
Yeah, so I was thinking when you were talking about new build houses, is building work a concern as well, especially where building materials might have been incorporated into the soil?
So less so today than they used to be. So historically, historically, building materials used to include, of course, asbestos we know about, paint, lead, we use paint containing lead quite often as well. So chippings from that would end up in the soil. All those sort of historical things, and we know in new builds, you sort of hear the stories when someone digs down in the garden and they find old sort of construction leftovers just beneath the surface, old bricks and bits of this and that. These days, that's less of a problem than it was. But if it's historical building product, then it may very well be something that has some paint, some old paint with lead in it, perhaps asbestos, and a few other sort of nasty bits. This really comes into its own when we talk about development on brownfield sites. I mean, it very much depends. One brownfield site is very, very different from another. But these are areas where the current government in Westminster is very much focused on getting the country going by building more and more houses, and brownfield sites are the focus for them. And indeed, the idea of ensuring quicker planning permission to get things built is going to be driving that over the next few years. Now, councils tend to request that developers carry out a survey that ensure that a site is safe and free contamination. But if you have brownfield sites near you and your house has been there for a while, it may be something that you may want to look into as well. Because I mean, the idea that a brownfield site has a boundary is a rather ridiculous one, because things can leach and can move around, and whether they're airborne things that travel in the wind or deeper down water table moves things around, as well as animals and people can spread things around. So being in proximity to a brownfield site is another reason that people sometimes decide that they'd rather check and be safe rather than take any unnecessary chances.
Is the main concern when people are growing food crops, or is it a case of just being near the soil itself that where contamination or other things could become an issue?
Well, it's a little bit of everything. The food crops are tricky because actually let's step back. If you think about soil contamination, there are three ways that things can cause problems for us. There are three ways rather that they can cause problems for us. So contamination in soil, we can absorb it dermally, so through contact with our skin. We can breathe in airborne elements, and we can ingest things. And the last one, the ingestion, is where the question about whether growing fruit and vegetables is the trickiest one. And I guess in that respect it is, because that third pathway is then open when you're growing those things. There are two things there. We're talking about bits of soil left on the produce we grow and then eating those, which is why it's always important to wash your produce very, very carefully, regardless of whether you grew it at home or bought it in the supermarket, really. And the other way is that some contaminants, lead, for example, can be taken up by the things we grow. Now, in that case, it's if you know that you have elevated levels of lead in your soil, and you're growing fruit or veg, particularly with root vegetables, for example, beware of the fact that root vegetables can take up the lead, and the lead can be inside the vegetable itself, so carrots, parsnips, things like that. Whereas, again, it all sort of depends on the levels of the contamination in the soil. But other produce, tomatoes, peppers, for example, don't take up a whole lot less of the lead. So provided you wash those carefully, you should be fine. But again, it depends very much on the level. And the tricky thing is that there isn't really a red line. So if you look at various guidelines around the world, in the UK, we have a guideline of, say, for allotments, it's 80 parts per million, 80 milligrams per kilogram. Whereas in other growing spaces, that can go up to as high as 200, 300, or 400. We've seen findings in the thousands. Indeed, there was a study done recently in Newcastle, where some of the allotments there, city centre allotments in Newcastle, had elevated levels of lead, and there was a study done by Newcastle University looking into this and suggested that maybe this isn't as much of a problem as we first thought, and that when they looked at the individuals using the allotments, the levels of lead in their bloodstreams were not as elevated as they would have thought. compared to those who are not taking part in the allotments. Now, there is an awful lot within that needs to be followed up, but nevertheless, basic principles like washing your produce, washing your hands, perhaps wearing gloves if you know that your soil has elevated levels of something like this, something like lead, are all very, very good best practice things to follow.
Yeah. So if we were to get a soil test done, I think sometimes they are a bit indecipherable when the results come through.
Yes.
When, for example, with your soil tests, do you just kind of give a reading as to what is in the soil, and then, like you say, it's on the onus is on the recipient of the test to kind of say, okay, well, I'm going to now go away and look at whether that's acceptable or not? Or do you send out kind of explanatory notes with them?
So this is very much the key. And indeed, when we started out, this was one of the frustrations we faced. This all started a long time ago with a little experience I had here in my own house, in my own garden, where I have always enjoyed growing vegetables. It's a long-standing infatuation I have that you can stick a seed in the ground and watch it grow, and eventually it fruits and becomes something you can eat. It's just the most amazing thing. And I regularly do this, and in the back garden we regularly grow things. And I was chatting with a neighbor here who mentioned to me that there was this was a conversation in passing. He mentioned that there was some industry here, not very far away from the house. And I thought, well, it was a battery factory actually. And I thought that doesn't sound terribly, eco-friendly, if you will. So I decided to look into the testing of soil, and this proved to be quite a fact. And the question you asked about the report. So yes, of course, we will provide the results and all the readings, but we also provide a report that tries to interpret these. There are UK safe for use levels for many of these things, but not all. We list those for all of the things we test for. And where there are no UK levels available, or none that have been published, we look further afield, whether that's Canada or the EU or US. We look at all of those. We provide a listing of those and give you an idea of what the acceptable levels are around the world. And you can make up your own mind. We sort of use a color code to give you an idea where your attention should be focused. So, green is fine. Orange is maybe worth a second look. And red is stop what you're doing and think twice. So it's very much a key. The interpretation of these results is very much a big part of what we do. Because as you say, the reports in themselves are incomprehensible. It's a series of numbers. It's hard to figure out even what the unit used even mean. So very much the interpretation is key.
Yeah, I sounded like that question. I planted that in there to make you sound good, but I genuinely didn't know if that's what you did. That's really good. Because they are. I've looked into getting them done before, and they're just a nightmare, to be honest with you. It's like I can have it done, but then what am I meant to do with that information? That actually means nothing to me. So that is a bit of a revelation there.
Precisely. And fertility is the same thing. That our testing customers are roughly half are interested in the fertility of the soil and half are interested in the contamination of the soil. There's actually a small, not quite half and half, maybe 45%, and then the other 10% are interested in both. And on the fertility side, it's the same thing. You can look at a relatively simple set of results that gives you your pH, gives you your organic content matter, the three major soil nutrients: magnesium, potassium, phosphorus, and also a description of the soil texture, sandy soil, clay soil, heavy, light, whatever. And then what? It's a very, very similar thing. We talk about some of these things, but when you look at the whole picture, it becomes very, very difficult to get your head around what they actually mean. So again, the reports aim to provide some sort of a context and sort of a best practice depending on what it is you want to grow. And that's another thing to consider, because on the fertility side, sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but I'll just get this one point in. On the fertility side, it's not always about trying to change the pH reading so that it fits whatever it is you're doing. It may sometimes make sense if you have acidic soil to alter the things you're trying to grow. So if you happen to have acidic soil in your garden, why not grow blueberries or fruits and things like that tend to thrive in that, rather than saying, oh, I need to change the pH because I'm trying to grow something entirely different. We've in the results we've seen, we've come across spectacularly offbeat pH readings with with soils that can, in some cases, are extremely acidic or indeed alkaline. And we know that most plants prefer oddly neutral soil conditions, so a pH of around 7. But adapting what it is you're trying to grow to the conditions rather than always trying to change the soil to suit you is yet another thing to consider. So, meeting somewhere in the middle is probably ideal.
Definitely. Yeah. I think probably I didn't actually stick that closely to the questions that I sent you beforehand. So I'm going completely off topic. But this is, I think, my last question that I'll ask you. And that is, I was thinking when you were speaking, do we need to have a test done more than once? Because I'm also thinking about the things that we could add to our soils, such as green waste or manure that's come or product that's come from green waste, and I'm guessing that's not routinely tested. So it could be that we kind of start off at one point, but then we add other things into our soils, and we might need to have the test done again. Is that the case?
Very much so, particularly on the fertility side. So soil pH can shift from year to year, and if you're liming the soil, or if you're adding sulfur to it, trying to again change the pH, whether or not it's actually taken, it's a chemical reaction. It doesn't happen overnight. Just simply adding something to it doesn't mean that presto it's done. The reaction has to take place. The amount you've added has to be broadly in line with how much you needed to make, how much of a change you needed to make. And then you don't need to, but chances are you'd be better off to know what the various things you've done what kind of an effect they've actually had on the soil. We know that we can add nutrients that are in short supply. Again, if it's very sandy soil, they can often just leach out and be gone within 6 months. So we should probably that treatment should probably include adding a lot of organic matter, whether it's manure or compost of some other kind, that will help retain some of those nutrients. As we said already, we can adjust the pH by adding lime. We can increase it. By adding lime to increase it, or we can add sulfur to lower it. Some of us who are a little bit older may remember using peat for that. Indeed, some of us used to swear by it, but that's no longer a thing. We can even attempt to make extremely heavy clay soils workable by adding some of that organic matter. But then once it's way through, you want to see what the effect of the things you've done is, particularly if you're trying to grow things that are sensitive to very small pH differences. So, and again, and adding some of these elements too close to the growing season, they may actually hurt the plants you're growing if the seedlings are in the area when you're actually putting some of these things down. So you want to plan a little bit further in advance. There's one more thing, which is a bit of an aside. It's not really an issue, but it has come up in that manure, of course, can carry some of the pathogens. So one needs to be careful. The E. coli and et cetera that can be present. And furthermore, it depends very much on what's on the pasture land. So if there are pesticides or herbicides present, that can sometimes show up in manure. At the point where you're using the manure, some of those pesticide and herbicide elements can remain and be passed on in manure onto your garden. So it's all part of a sort of a circular pattern we follow. The manure comes from an animal that lived on pasture that may have had some of these things in it. It will pass it on. It'll end up in your garden, and you'll think that you've been growing in the most organic manner possible, and yet can end up with some of these things affecting some of the crops you're trying to help. So, just something to keep in mind.
Thank you to Robert for speaking about this really important topic. I'd love to hear from you if you've had a soil test done or if you're thinking about it, and whether you found the process easy in the past. Thank you for listening. Now here's Dr. Ian Bedford talking about the sort of bugs we might be getting more familiar with as we turn our attention from outdoor flowers to indoor ones.
There's never a time of year when gardening has to stop, although the motivation to venture outside on a cold, damp and overcast winter's day might be lacking a little for some of us. So why not use this time of year to focus on any indoor plants that might have been neglected over the warmer months? Besides a bit of pruning, repotting and feeding, it's a perfect time to check for infestations of hemipteran insects, the sapsuckers, which are the most common group of delicate indoor plant pests, and include species of aphids, whitefly, mealybugs and scale insects. Sap-sucking pests can cause serious problems to tender plants as they siphon out the phloem and progressively weaken the plant. Left untreated, they can build up large populations and will readily spread to other plants around the house. Despite large infestations, some of these sapsuckers are not easily seen whilst they feed motionlessly on the undersides of leaves or along the stems. However, there's often a telltale sign when a plant is infested, which provides us with the opportunity to deal with it. And this sign is the presence of little sticky droplets on the upper surfaces of lower leaves and on the table or floor below the plant pot. These sticky droplets are the excess sugars that the insects excrete whilst they feed, commonly known as honeydew, and often contaminated with a black sooty mould. Once detected, the simplest and safest way to control the infestation is by using a proprietary soap-based plant protection product that not only removes the sapsuckers by a non-toxic physical means, but also washes away the honeydew and the moulds.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.